Let's see, I think we'll give people a little bit more time to log on before we stop.
Yeah.
Or start.
'83, no, 56, 58, 60.
Well, it's climbing.
Let's see. So I think we can get started now. I'm lucky enough to be introducing our panel today. My name is Emma Miller, and I am the Outreach Director of the Buckley Program. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the third panel of our 2020 conference. Today's panel is Yale in the 60s. College campuses, and Yale in particular, often make the news over concerns like protests or cancel culture. As we reflect throughout this week on the 60s, we have invited back some esteemed Yale alumni to share what Yale life was like in the 60s. I look forward to hearing about the priorities of students, political involvement of students in student organizations, and intellectual diversity in the classroom. Before I introduce our guest this afternoon, I want to say a few words about the Buckley Program. The William F. Buckley Jr. Program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We host lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2010. Our over 300 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley Program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. Now, on to our guests today. Sam Chauncey is a longtime Yale administrator and leader of the school, having served as Assistant Dean of Yale College, Special Assistant and Chief of Staff to Yale President Kingman Brewster, and Secretary and Vice President of Yale. Chauncey went on to lead the Science Park Development Corporation as President and CEO, and taught as a lecturer and head of the Health Management Program at the Yale School of Public Health. He graduated with a BA from Yale in 1957. Jay Gitlin is Senior Lecturer in History at Yale University. He has taught courses on the American West, Quebec and Canada, Native American history, suburbanization, popular music, and the history of shopping. He is currently teaching Cities of Empire with his colleague Paul Kennedy. His book, The Bourgeois Frontier, French Towns, French Traders, and American Expansion received the 2010 Alf Andrew Hegoy Prize for the best book in French colonial history. His most recent book is Country, Acres, and Cul-de-sacs, about the rebranding of Connecticut from 1938 to 1952. He is currently co-editing with Ryan-Andre Berceau a special issue of Quebec Studies on Creole History and Identity to appear in the spring of 2021. A pianist, band leader, and member of the American Federation of Musicians since the age of 13, he continues to play dance jigs and jazz concerts on a regular basis. He has been an on-camera commentator and consultant for several television shows on the History Channel and Connecticut Public Television, including Suburbia, The Good Life in Connecticut, nominated for a regional Emmy. Professor Gitlin graduated with his BA from Yale in 1971, his music master's in 1974, and later a PhD in history. Geoffrey Kabaservice, our third panelist, is the Director of Political Studies at the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C. He was a visiting assistant professor of history at Yale in 2007 to 2008. He is the author of several books, including The Guardians, A History of Yale During the Presidency of Kingman Brewster Jr., and Rule and Ruin, A History of the Moderate Wing of the Republican Party. He has written for a wide variety of publications and is a columnist with the British newspaper, The Guardian. Mr. Kabaservice graduated from Yale with a BA in political science and his history PhD. We'll begin by having each guest give a brief opening statement, followed by questions from myself, and finally questions from the audience, which you can submit throughout via Zoom's question and answer feature. With that, please join me in warmly welcoming back Sam Chauncey, Jay Gitlin, and Geoffrey Kabaservice virtually to Yale and to the Buckley Program. Mr. Chauncey, I believe you're going first, so you can begin.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you for having me as part of this panel. I want to just suggest your title about the political and academic climate at Yale in the 60s, that we might define the actual time a little differently and say that 1960 to 63 is really part of the 50s, and that's really my generation. It is 63 to perhaps 72, which is the period I think you want to look at. So my remarks will be really focused on that particular segment. First, the context that was around the university and the students who were here. This was the period of the war in Vietnam. This is the period of the feminist movement with Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique, the environmental movement with Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring, the civil rights movement, vote for the people, the Black people, the Stonewall riots and the gay and lesbian movements. It's the period of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy, who were all young leaders in the country. And it's a period which I've tended to call the period of challenge to authority. It's a time when people, not only students, but people across the country, were challenging the old authority and the old norms. Now, turning to Yale itself and the three segments I think you asked us to comment on. First, the social, and I mean this not only social life, but I mean sociology too. This is a period in which Yale moves from being a very paternalistic institution to a much free and open. And I mean by that, rules were done away with. The coat and tie rule, the class attendance rule, the rule about when women were allowed in men's rooms, and so on. And these begin to disappear, and the life of the student becomes far more directed by the student, him or herself. It's the period in which Yale turns to coeducation. And the first women were admitted for the class of 1971, I think. Wasn't it your class, Jay? I think so. And it's also the period when the makeup of Yale classes is moving away from the sort of Northeast white prep school group to broadly based across the country, and just beginning to go international, but that comes really later. It's also significantly the period in which Yale ends actual discrimination against Jews. In the political sense, the period when I was in college in the 1950s and continuing in the beginning of the 60s, there's no question that students were very conservative. And I use that word perhaps slightly differently than it might be used today. Students in my generation were not really very interested in politics. So I don't mean necessarily politically conservative, but they were conservative in that they came from this same background of the private school, where people tended to be more conservative in their social norms as well as political. There are certainly in the 60s, meaning 63 on, you see more students who are more liberal, and again, not just politically, but in the way they live their lives. And interestingly enough, I did a few studies then, and I was surprised by the number of students who seemed to me to be quite liberal, who were actually children of graduates of Yale. So they were shedding and challenging their own parental authority as well as otherwise. It's the beginning of a period in which actual politics within Yale moves away from the traditional political union, which was the home of students who had a genuine interest in politics. And you begin to have other political groups, such as the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS. And you have we didn't have many of them, but the weather underground people. It's also a period in which students rallied together politically about a particular cause, starting with causes within the university. I think the first protest we really had was about a philosophy professor who was not granted tenure. And it wasn't a political issue in the sense of the professor's politics. It was a question of how tenure was granted. And most significantly to me on the political side was that, unlike today, in this period, you have a lot of outside of class discussion and debate. And there were frequent debates between faculty members. I remember a wonderful one between the Dean of Yale College, a professor of English, William Devane, and a Professor Pollard in the physics department about the humanities versus the sciences. And then, of course, there was the continuing debates between Bill Buckley and Bill Coffin, the chaplain of Yale. And those debates just entranced everybody. As to the academic side of things, in the 1950s and in the beginning of the 60s, students really, for the most part, are not interested in academics. They were here to develop their social life and to get ready for a job. And so there were fewer students who were devoted intellectually to what they might have been otherwise. It's a period in which Yale begins to hire more PhDs for the faculty who come from great state universities. Prior to that time, a very large percentage of the faculty were Yale PhDs. So the faculty was closed and very much in the Yale mode, and it's beginning to open up now as the PhDs come from the great state universities and other institutions. You're beginning to move away academically from the purely departmental education, that is history, English, chemistry, whatever, to more interdepartmental and interdisciplinary work. And people see education not in the very old-fashioned departmental fixture, but as a broader concept. There are many, many in this period of 63 to 72, many more students who were genuinely interested in their intellectual development and the work they were pursuing. And last but not least, this is the beginning of modern science at Yale. Prior to this time, Yale was extremely poor in science, and they're just beginning under Presidents Griswold and Brewster to bring first-class scientists to the institution. But at the same time, the institution continued to strengthen the humanities and the social sciences as much as they could. So I'll leave that there and let you go on to the next person.
Thank you. Next up is Professor Jay Gitlin.
Thank you, Emma. So I just want to mention very quickly, I found out that my roommate and one of my best friends, Jim Babst, was actually related to the Buckleys. I didn't know this as an undergraduate. It turns out that his uncle's sister, whose name was Aloise Steiner, was actually Bill Buckley's mother. And I had no idea. And none of us did, but apparently Jimmy used to drive up to Sharon, Connecticut to the compound, the Buckley compound. And we found this out much later and said, really? He said, oh yeah, no, I had a great time up there. Bill Buckley was nice, but I really liked Jim Buckley, his brother, who was Senator Buckley. So anyway, just thought I'd throw that out. Now, back to what Sam said. I want to add one more sort of aspect, structural aspect or aspect of context, which is, as the only person here who was actually an undergraduate, and I will try to recollect to the best of my ability what it was, my mindset was like in the late 60s and early 70s. One of the things that your generation should know is that we were baby boomers, and we had a very much a sense of ourselves as having a generational identity. To be a baby boomer also meant to be catered to from the time we were born, so that the #1 hit on the Billboard charts the year I was born, which was, oh my God, 1949, was Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. It was a kid song. And so this continued for our whole life. The other thing I'll mention is that our senior year in high school, the #1 book that everybody in my generation read was Marshall McLuhan, The Medium is the Massage. And so we felt that we were very media savvy. We grew up with rock and roll being a kind of secret musical language. And we were sort of taught by Marshall McLuhan to look behind the news. What's really the hidden agenda here? And so something, in case anybody's interested, the record that we listened to the most on campus as Yale undergraduates was a record by the Firesign Theater, F-I-R-E, Fire, S-I-G-N, Firesign Theater. They were hysterical to us. It was like media humor, somewhat sort of psychedelic. I found out much later that 3 of the 4 members of the Firesign Theater were actually Yaleys, one of whom donated their original record to the Elizabethan Club. And this is what we listened to all the time, in case anybody wants to hear this. Their hit record was Don't Crush That Dwarf, Hand Me the Pliers. So that will speak to our political consciousness. Now, moving on from the context, I teach a class, as some of your listeners may know, called Yale in America. So I constantly have students asking me, gee, how is our Yale different from your Yale? And I know they're expecting me to say something about diversity. Okay, sure, yes, that's true. But if I really try to think what was different, and this is my most sincere and honest answer, we heard music all the time. Kids would put speakers attached to their phonographs out the window, and they play music out the window so that everybody on Old Campus could hear. When you walked down Elm Street on a Saturday night, you heard a live band playing for a dance coming from every college, if you can imagine that. So this is part of why I want to convey to you, you heard music, there were live bands, there were dances. We had a kind of somewhat informal social structure, so that in the fall season, you had a date. You would pick up your date at the bus station, and then you went to dinner Friday night in the college. The next day you went to the football game. That's what we all did. We went to the football game. If the weather was a little chilly, so much the better, because you want to snuggle up a little bit. Saturday night, there was a dance at the college. So this is how it went. And it went from the beginning of the football season to the Harvard game. And by the end of the Harvard game, you had some idea who you might want to ask to go to the Yale prom in February. So these were our big concerns. It really revolved around social life. We also wore sports jackets to class all the time. There was a coat and tie rule still in existence until about the middle of our experience at Yale. So to this day, I still wear sports jackets all the time. We called each other, and the teachers called us by our last names. So I still call my roommates, hey, Addison, how you doing? Babst, how are you? So we called ourselves. So there was still a somewhat preppy aspect to Yale, fairly preppy, and yet we knew things were changing. So the way I would describe this, and I have described it in print, is that we lived in an era of impending change. And I think I wrote down here, impending change, not yet arrived, but expected sometime before midnight. So we felt this transition. It hadn't changed yet, but it was expected. So witness the birth of ironic distance, a key survival mechanism, which I would define as 1 part raised consciousness, 1 part prep school sarcasm, and 2 parts gin and vermouth. Now, the last thing I'll say here is that we were also intellectually, at least in our room, very, very serious. We would talk about Parmenides and Dante and Edmund Spencer till 3 o'clock in the morning. I still do this with my roommates. We call each other and we still talk about this. And we went to all the master's teas. And so, and by the way, one of my roommates, who was a philosophy major, whenever I thought I was winning the argument, he would get out the original Greek of Parmenides and said, see, if you read the Greek, you would know that I'm right. So these were the kind of discussions we had. And we went to all the master's tea, and I'll just mention that one of them, well, one was Hannah Arendt. I remember her, and a famous jazz musician at the time, Charles Lloyd. But the one that I certainly remember was Norman Mailer, who was a very famous novelist at the time. And to end my little segment here, I wrote down one of the sentences he said, which captures a lot of us, for a lot of us, our view of politics. Norman Mailer said, politics is a mess of crap that everybody chews, but only some find tasteless. And with that, I yield to Jeff.
Thanks, Jay. How to follow that? I work in politics, you know.
Sorry.
I just want to say that I'm very happy to be back here with the Buckley program. Thanks to everyone for joining us. My sympathies with the students whose existence has been disrupted by this pandemic. I actually went to work for Sam Tannenhouse for a number of years when I was a grad student on the biography he was authorized to write of Bill Buckley. And so I spent years in Buckley's papers at Yale, and on occasion would actually go down to Stamford, to his house on Wallack's Point, and just hang out with the man himself. So it's always an enjoyable thing to come back to the Buckley program activities. I don't know if this was how you planned it, Emma, but we have 4 generations represented on screen here. Sam is what was part of what was known as the silent generation, not the nicest term, I guess, but that is how they were called. Of course, Jay is part of the baby boomers. I'm a Generation Xer. I graduated from Yale in 1988. And you, Emma, I guess, are a Generation Z person, which means that only the millennials are left out. So expect to get an angry note from them because they don't like being left out. Anyway, I mean, what to tell you about my time as an undergraduate? I mean, the focus here is on the 60s. You know, I generally enjoyed my time at Yale. You know, in terms of a transition that was going to happen at midnight, I do remember that when I was living on the old campus, somebody in McClellan Hall every night would blast out the Bruce Springsteen song, Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Not sure if that was the change you had in mind, Jay. I can't listen to that song to this day. But anyway, I was an undergraduate. I was in the political union. I was in the Tory party, which I, at least in my own mind, was the center-right party. And that's more or less where I have been to this day. But the thing that interested me about Yale more than any of the subjects that I took was actually Yale itself. I was interested in history, but I found the vast sweep of American history just too big to grasp. But I could grasp Yale's history. I could actually see, you know, the past in the buildings there, and I was curious about why things were the way they were. And I came to believe that, in fact, the changes that Yale went through in the 1960s had really been the most important determination of why Yale was like, why it was like it was in my day, and why it has continued to be that way. Because I think the university structurally hasn't changed that much since the early 1970s, by which point Kingman Brewster's efforts as president were more or less complete. So anyway, I wrote about Yale-related subjects in my dissertation and eventually published my book, The Guardians, which was mostly a biography of Kingman Brewster and his friends in what was called the liberal establishment. But a lot of it was about Yale in the 1960s and looking at the way in which the national changes made themselves felt on campus. Now, I don't know how many of you who are in this call identify as conservatives, but you know, one of the subjects that occurred to me as someone who was somewhat conservative on campus was this. Yale had a reputation for being the most conservative of all the Ivies, and maybe the most conservative university in the entire United States. And yet in a very short amount of time, in the mid-1960s, it went from basically the 1930s because it would have been a very familiar scene in 1963 to a graduate of the 1930s, to the modern era. And how did that happen? And I've met a lot of other conservatives over the years who are very angry at Yale, and they can't always quite articulate why it is, why things that happen on campus make them disproportionately angry. But I think they have a sense that this conservative institution was taken away from them, and they don't really know how or why that is. And then the other thing is that a lot of conservatives look at what happens on campus. This is actually just about precisely the 5-year anniversary of the great snowflake controversy. And I was actually here for a William F. Buckley Program conference that was disrupted by people who were still angry about this. Nicholas Christakis had been up all night, actually for 2 nights at the time this happened. He was the subject of international news. He was the first speaker at that conference. It was a fairly dramatic moment. And the question that comes up from time to time is, these things we don't like, these aspects of illiberalism on the left, political correctness, whatever you want to call it. To what extent is this the fault of Kingman Brewster and Yale during the 1960s? And I think maybe that's some of what we might get into in our discussion. Let me just add a little bit to what Sam had said. When we talk about Yale as a conservative institution, by that we mean, largely that students were personally conservative and they tended to vote Republican. The faculty also voted Republican overwhelmingly up until the 1960s. And that changed really with the classes slightly ahead of Jay's. So the class of 1968, when it came in as freshmen, all of those men, about 50% of them said that they identified as Republican. And by the time they graduated, relatively few of them still identified as Republican. So the change happened in those years. It was a consequence of, again, some of the developments Sam mentioned, particularly the civil rights movement, particularly anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. But also it was a consequence of Yale's, I guess what you would call inbreeding, because Yale was the most inbred of all of the Ivies. And if you go back to the classes of the late 30s and the early 40s, half of the undergraduates were preceded at Yale by their fathers. And considerably more than half, close to 2/3, had had at least some male relative at Yale before them, whether that was a grandfather or an uncle or a brother. I don't remember the exact stat, but I think it was something like 80 to 90% of undergraduates in that era were from private schools. And in particular, a real handful of prep schools really dominated Yale. Our late friend Eli Clark, who was a law professor at Yale and master of Silliman College, was in the class of 1943. And I remember going through and counting this, and something like 1/3 of his class came from one school, which was Andover. And then another 10% came from Hotchkiss, and there were other few feeder schools that really dominated the university, and they carried the prep school culture with them to Yale, and much of what went on at Yale was a reflection of that culture. And Yale didn't really see itself up until the 1960s or 1950s, I would say, as a university on the forefront of scholarship and learning. I think it would have more seen its role to keep the ideals of the WASP upper class safe from rot and rust. And this began to change with Whitney Griswold's presidency in the 1950s. Whit was the most conservative person, I think, who ever considered himself a liberal. He was one of the very few Democrats on the Yale faculty in the 1930s and into the 40s, but he still really retained a lot of that small c conservative sense of what Yale was about. But he really wanted the faculty to be excellent. And for that reason, he actually really broke down a lot of the barriers that had kept the departments from considering scholars from outside of Yale. And that really initiated the change, because when the faculty got here, they wanted to teach bright undergraduates who were interested in what they had to offer. And that led to a lot of changes. And then you saw that with a very slower reform on the side of the undergraduates. So the class of 1967 was actually the first Yale class in which more than half of the student body came from public schools. And that was, a level that Princeton had reached in 1955 and Harvard had reached in the 1940s. Thanks partly to Sam's dad, who was a dean at Harvard and was responsible for broadening its national outreach. So that was, again, part of why Yale was conservative up to that point and then changed after that. But I will say that something that strikes me, especially in hindsight, is that you baby boomers, Jay, in those late 60s years and early 70s really had the best of both worlds, because you still had a number of the faculty who were deeply devoted to Yale and to teaching and to the undergraduates, and spent a lot of time with them, listening to them, sometimes arguing with them, but really getting to know them as people. And Kingman Brewster had a pretty simple formulation for why Yale survived the turmoils of the 1960s when so many other universities did not. And he said, everyone here is known intimately by someone who is known intimately to me. And that sense of Yale as being a community was a large part of what preserved the place. And it's still something that I think we want Yale to be. And yet there is also the imperative of scholarship and free speech and open expression. And these two ideals can work against each other in some ways. I think Brewster managed that tension and that balance. I wouldn't say that all of his successors have been equally successful, but let's leave it at that for the time being and get into the discussion.
Thank you so much. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground already. You guys really handled both what Yale was like at different times and how those transitions work. I'm curious, it seemed a common theme that Yale became more academically focused as we progressed through this time period. So I'd like to hear perhaps from each of you, I guess, how traditionally classical your liberal arts education was. Right now, there's a lot of criticism of the directed studies program, but how much was that sort of great books learning worked into your education at Yale? And what sort of discussions took place in the class? How broad was the spectrum of ideas considered and openly debated? And how invested were students in working on that?
Well, I'll go back to the earlier days. The directed studies program was started in the 50s by Dean Devane, who I mentioned before. And most of the current curriculum was designed by Devane in the 50s. Now, there have been a lot of tweaks and so on, but it's essentially the same curriculum. I think what I believe is that, first of all, by broadening the faculty, you brought in people who were challenging the students more. And a lot of the students began to respond to that challenge. Secondly, I think that as the student body was broadened across the country, the admissions office had the chance to choose more really bright students. There were just plain more bright students in the pool that you were looking at. And that resulted in, because the university wanted to get the best students it could, in having some bright students and some bright faculty who really went after each other in the classroom and enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'll just say that you asked Emma about discussions in the classroom. Well, discussions in the classroom were about what we had read for that week. When I took Ed Morgan, who I think was Sam's advisor, Ed Morgan taught colonial history and 18th century American history. And for 2 whole weeks, the topic of discussion was, what was a minister's salary in the 18th century? And he sent us scurrying to the archives. It's like, how do you actually find that out? And that's what we talked about. The best class I took at Yale was on Dante, Dante in translation. I was so, to use a 60s phrase, blown away by Dante. I was inspired to write a series of jazz pieces on the different cantos. So we talked about Dante for weeks. But to understand, I very rarely took classes in the social sciences. So I took, most of my classes were in the humanities. And we talked about, things in the Western tradition, to use that old phrase. Vincent Scully was the go-to class. That's what we all studied. So we didn't talk about current events except in one class, which was a class taught by Charlie Reich, who was sort of a guru of the 60s. He wrote a book called The Greening of America, and he was a law school professor, and it was called The Individual in America. It was an American Studies class, which gave me a certain attitude towards American Studies. It was a huge class, and it was known as a gut. The entire football team was in this class. And he would read from the New York Times and basically make fun of the New York Times at the start of every class. But he didn't do so from a conservative position. It was really more from a kind of absurdist position. I don't know how else to describe it. But just very quickly, something that Jeff mentioned was about a sense of community. So to me, one of the things that we might want to talk about that I think is a really important aspect of change was that we all felt we belonged to Yale. We did feel that there was a personal connection. Everybody knew, there was somebody looking over your shoulder. People cared about what happened to you, and there was a sense of community. And I think maybe that's something, it's a very hard thing to put your finger on. It's like, what causes this? But it's something I try to do in my classes. So at the end of my Yale in America class, we all learn how to do the Yale long cheer. And the entire class, many of whom are science majors or first gen students, they have a ball doing the Yale long cheer that people knew how to do back in the 40s and 30s. And so I think the idea of belonging to something bigger than yourself is still important, but I think that's what's decreased over time.
To which I would say, Jay, brekekekek coax coax.
Exactly. We can do the Yale long cheer later.
Again, to sort of get to this theme of the 60s, it's never easy to be a conservative at a liberal university. I didn't have an easy time in that sense in the 80s, but I didn't feel oppressed. It was more that I really didn't see eye to eye with my TAs, who were all grad students who were considerably more to the left of most of the professors at that point, although I don't think I even would have phrased it in left-right terms. I just didn't like where they were coming from. And they duly punished me with bad grades, as was their right, and I didn't care. And I think, to be honest, I was probably more of an autodidact at Yale than I was anything else. The most influential book, really, in terms of the next decade, was that I came across old issues of the Harkness Hoot, which was an undergraduate magazine published from a left-wing perspective, actually, by cultural conservatives, if that makes any sense, back at Yale in the late 1920s and early 1930s. So anyway, in the 1960s, though, again, I think you had actually a faculty that in some ways was more conservative than the students because they were like a lot of Yale holdovers, and that made for an interesting and productive dialogue. And I think that what confronted conservatives back then in, let's say, the late 60s, early 70s, was not so much political repression as, to some extent, social marginalization from other more liberal students. And you would have to do something which I never have done, and try to figure out to what extent were conservative students actually tapped for secret societies. But again, the funny thing I actually remember from doing the warm-up act for George W. Bush at his 50th reunion 2 years ago was that George W. Bush actually was in the class of 68, but for all intents and purposes, he was in the 1950s. Someone asked him about demonstrations. He was like, "What demonstrations? I never saw any. How about hippies? Nope, didn't know any." And it was entirely possible to go through Deke and Yale and be kind of unaffected by all that. That became, somewhat less so. But there were a lot of conservatives who took their ideology more seriously, who were more political in that sense, who were very upset by what happened at Yale in the late 1960s. And yet, I have yet to come across any real instances of them being politically oppressed. There was at one point just before the May Day demonstration in 1970, where one of the conservatives in the party of the right stood up in the JE dining hall and made a toast to Bobby Seale and the Black Panthers, whose trial was the subject of this big rally that it was feared might end up with Yale getting burned down. And he said, "Justice for Bobby Seale, execution. Justice for the Black Panthers, extermination." And his little table cheered him and he sat down, and there was kind of shocked gasps from the rest of the dining hall, but nothing else happened. I don't think that sort of thing would happen nowadays for various reasons.
One thing I would add quickly is that I find in the earlier years that students and faculty were more interested in the university itself and the policies the university was pursuing. If you read the Yale Daily News in the 60s, you find, first of all, that every single day there is one or two editorials, and usually one of them is about some Yale policy, that students are really arguing about whether the admissions program is right or a rule or whatever it may be. The faculty were not siloed the way they are today. The faculty enjoyed those debates I mentioned earlier, where you had someone in philosophy and someone in science debating big issues, sometimes just institutional issues, but broader issues. I think people care less about the institution as an institution, which they feel they should have a little bit of responsibility for forming.
I just, Emma, just add two quick things. I'm in touch right now with all of my classmates because I'm in charge of this 50th reunion class book. And we politically were a very mixed bag. And I find that 50 years later, they love Yale. They're so happy to be together with all their Yale classmates once again in anticipation of their 50th reunion. And if there's one thing that concerns them, it's cancel culture. The idea that somebody can be canceled is abhorrent to them no matter where they fall on the political spectrum. And they're mostly very liberal. So that bothers them. So I think the role of social media is something that should be discussed. And very quickly, I want to recommend to everybody that they find copies of the old Harkness Hoot, which is hysterical. And I'll just mention one of the great lines in Yale history, I think, was that they were very critical of the Sterling Library building because they felt it was dishonest. It should have been modern architecture, not this collegiate Gothic. And so one of the fellows who was writing this editorial said, let's face it, there is absolutely no veritas in this building and precious little lux.
I'm struck by what you guys describe as the interest in Yale's policies. And recently we've seen kind of an increased awareness of Yale alumni about the makeup of the Yale Corporation and Board of Trustees. So I'm curious if you have any opinions on if you were even aware of the Board of Trustees when you were at Yale or recent graduates, and what your perceptions are in general. I know that the board saw its first Jewish trustee in the 60s. And recently we have, I believe, another Jewish person running for trustee and increased diversity of women and just non sort of groomed by Yale candidates.
When I was an undergraduate, I didn't even know there was a Yale Corporation. I had no idea. Obviously, once I became an officer of the university, I was actually secretary of the corporation. The corporation has changed in many ways over the years. And interestingly enough, it was in the 60s and 70s, it was far more open and transparent than it is today. But I think a lot of people misunderstand the role of trustees and the role of a board of trustees as a sounding board and a helpmate to the president and his colleagues. The administration runs the university. The board doesn't run it. And the university's policies are developed by the president and his colleagues, and they bring those policies forward if they need actual approval by the board.
I'll just add very quickly, Emma, that in my generation, class of 71, we were vaguely aware of the corporation. I'm pretty sure I could not have told you most of the people on the corporation, but also more importantly, we did not think it was our business to run the university. And it's like, there are adults who do that. Oh my God, I would not trust us to run a university. But the other reason for that is Jeff said so perfectly, we had the best of all worlds. It's like our leaders were Kingman Brewster, Sam Chauncey, Dean George May, and William Coffin at Battelle Chapel. They were our heroes. We looked up to them. They're still my heroes, and that I can speak for all my classmates. And we thought they were people of honor, and we looked to them for leadership.
I didn't really know much about the Yale Corporation as an undergraduate. Of course, I came to know a considerable amount about the corporation in the 1960s. Two things I would say is that the corporation in the 60s really had, extremely well-known and nationally influential people on it. And they had strong opinions, and there were a lot of interesting discussions in the corporation that, alas, the minutes never really fully record, because that's part of Yale's institutional reticence, I guess. But I think it was very helpful for King and Brewster to have someone like John Lindsay, the mayor of New York City, actually coming up from New York to talk with, Bill Bundy, who had been, one of the architects of the Vietnam War and the Lyndon Johnson administration, and a lot of other people, with very strong opinions and a lot of stature to hash out these issues. And, there's an interesting quote that that Kingman Brewster made to one of his other aides besides Sam. I think this was John Fanton, about one of the people on in his administration who was more conservative, particularly about Yale. And he said, he doesn't agree with the changes that we're making, but what he doesn't understand is that to keep Yale Yale, to retain what's really most important about the place, we have to make these changes, because otherwise we would lose much more. And I think, that's actually something worth keeping in mind when we talk about, what exactly kind of changes have happened since the 1960s, which of them would we be willing to give up? And it's a natural tendency, I think, of alumni at Yale to always look back overly nostalgically, perhaps. There's a classic joke: how many Yale alumni does it take to screw in a light bulb? And the answer is 21. 1 to screw it in, and 20 to talk about how much better the old light bulb was. But
Good one, Jeff.
I think that it was actually a useful thing in the older corporation days to have a lower bar to nominating an independent candidate for the corporation. That was how Bill Horowitz, the first Jewish trustee, got on. And I interviewed him and asked him how many signatures he had to get to file his petition candidacy. He remembered something like 250.
It was 250, yeah.
A very low bar.
It was
But when Jimmy Kirchick ran a few years ago, they set an impossibly high bar for him. And Victor Ashe, I think, with all the money in the world, is going to have a hard time clearing that bar as well. And this
he has cleared it, and so has Maggie Thomas. But it's impossibly high bar.
Yeah. It is a very high bar, and it can only be done with a real organized effort, which it comes with some costs of its own. So anyway, I think the corporation, like the faculty and the student body, should not be overly afraid of dissenting views, and I welcome those petition candidacies.
This next question comes from the audience, but Professor Gitlin, you mentioned that Yale students now feel like they have a strong ownership over what Yale should do and how Yale should be run. I'm curious how Yale interacted with New Haven when you guys were students at Yale. Currently, I think today there was an article put out of the mayor of New Haven saying that Yale should be donating $50 million a year instead of $13 million, because Yale's financially very sound in their budget reports they just issued. So I'm curious, what was Yale's involvement with New Haven? What was the students' involvement with New Haven? Was there sort of a service aspect, or was there a Yale bubble?
There was absolutely a Yale bubble. People did not know what was beyond the walls. I was one of the few who did, because I played gigs. I played in every Black church on Dixwell Avenue, Easter services. It was all about being a musician. So I knew musicians from the entire New Haven area. We would play weddings up in Hamden. I would play at the Park Plaza all the time. I was one of the few people who knew how to navigate New Haven and get beyond Orange Street. So there was absolutely a Yale bubble. So that hasn't changed. And I think that's very unfortunate. I think it's still Fortress Yale, and I don't think that's a good thing. And that's something we were concerned with, but it was still in existence, certainly when I was an undergrad. The talk, to speak about contributions, the more sort of institutional and economic relationship, it's not for me to really say, but I would say this. Over time, and it's certainly more true today than it was even 40, 50 years ago, Yale owns more of the real estate in downtown New Haven. Yale supplies probably a higher percentage of the jobs. I'm just guessing at this. I have no statistics. So I think Yale is more involved with the economy of the city. That's an issue that needs to be considered. So I would answer it that way.
I started Yale's first community relations program in 1970. And prior to that, there really had been no no real interaction except through the president and the mayor, who happened to know each other. But there was very little going on. And my philosophy in starting the office was a phrase that I used all the time, and that is, if New Haven fails, Yale fails, and if Yale fails, New Haven fails. The two are tied in together. And we have not found the happy conclusion to that yet, despite the effort of a lot of people.
You know, the antagonism between Yale and New Haven goes back a long way. And it was quite regularly in the 19th century that you would have town gown riots. And actually some of these continued into the early 20th century as well. And Yale, you know, really walled itself off with the construction of the old campus in the late 19th century, after having been a pretty open place with only really the fence to delineate Yale and New Haven. You know, I think that New Haven is a city whose industrial peak was almost maybe 100 years ago. Doug Ray wrote a classic book called City, where he kind of concluded that, you know, although New Haven had a pretty corrupt government in the early 20th century, that probably was its peak of existence as a city. And it's struggled with difficulties ever since. You know, I think Yale probably does find it in its own enlightened self-interest to contribute something to the continued, if not prosperity of New Haven, at least the stability. Whether that's 50 million or somewhat more than 13 million, I think is just a matter of negotiation.
Thank you. We have a few questions in the chat going back to the comments on unity of the student body, about what the shift was when women joined the Yale class. In the first class, the ratio, I believe, was 1 woman for every 4 men. So how did that shift the dynamic? How long did it take for social integration and general, possibly a shift in activities that people engaged in the social sphere, and just what did that look like?
Well, when we admitted women to Yale College, women had been admitted to the graduate schools for some time, but when we admitted women to Yale College, which was done, the decision was made in December of '69, and the first women had to be admitted in the following March. So A, we had no additional dormitories. B, the president had made the decision, which he continued to say there were going to be 1,000 male leaders, and that didn't help him a bit. But nevertheless, there was a commitment to continue to admit 1,000 males to the class. So in the first group, there were 750 women, 250 freshmen, 250 sophomores, and 250 juniors. So the ratio was even worse than you have just described. It took, I would say it took about 12 years to get even close to 50-50 where it is now, but I don't remember exactly how many years it took.
Yeah, I'll just say, as a member of the class of '71, the first class with women, it was very awkward. There were very many awkward moments. I think most of us felt that our relationship to the new students, the new women students, should be, if anything, much more like brothers and sisters. So there was not a lot of dating. There was some, not as much as you might think. It definitely, the consensus, you know, it was still very much a kind of old Yale campus. From what I know from my classmates who are women now, they were, for the most part, not interested in going to the football games, except as dates, if even that. So that the kind of unity that you had definitely started changing, you know, but I can tell this, I can report that 50 years later, we are very bound together and we feel very solidly like classmates and enjoy each other's company. So it may have taken 50 years, but we are all, you know, Yale class of '71, and we're very united in that sense.
You know, when the university went coeducational, it didn't obviously become 50-50 male and women because there simply wasn't space. So the early classes included fewer women because, you know, there was bad enough crowding as it was, but to have admitted more than that would have just created insuperable logistical difficulties. And my perception from having interviewed a lot of those women in the first classes is that they were really recruited for their toughness, as well as for their intellect and abilities. And they put up with a lot more than subsequent classes had, and yet sort of bore it all with remarkable equanimity. But I do remember having a conversation with Sam. I can't remember whether this is one of our recorded interviews or not, where you, Sam, thought that obviously it was a big deal in the Yale culture that women were arriving and coeducation was coming here, because Yale's identity, again, had been as male. In fact, you can find at various points, Yale men or Yale man is just a one-word thing, which appears in newspaper articles. Yale was really designed the kind, particularly residential colleges, with this kind of heavy masculine medievalism in mind, which is why so many women complained about the heavy doors and the gates and all the rest of it in those early years. But on the other hand, really Yale's commitment to excellence was enhanced by women coming to Yale. And it's, how would I put this, sort of its status atop the socioeconomic hierarchy was not affected, because the people who sent their sons to Yale also had daughters. And that became pretty quickly part of the accepted picture.
Yeah, well, Jeff, you're absolutely right. It was a tremendous shock to Yale culture, because you have to remember the following things. When those women came, it was one thing that we admitted women to the undergraduate school, but there was only one tenured woman faculty member in Yale College in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And you had an enormous amount of Yale was run by women. There were women librarians and women who were the assistants to the heads of colleges. And we found a lot of resistance from those women to the women we were admitting. To this day, Yale has, I believe, 13 officers. Only 3 of them are women, and only 1 of them deals with students. So that the culture has not totally changed. We have a long way to go to make Yale a place in which a young woman can find lots of role models, lots of people that they could talk to, and so on. And so it's misunderstood that just because we admitted women as undergraduates, therefore Yale all of a sudden became perfect. It has a long way to go in that.
I just add a fast story, Emma. So one of my students, who I think was involved with the Buckley Foundation, Nathaniel Zelinsky, well, his mom was my classmate, Doris Dronsky. And over the years, I was talking about the unity of the class of 71, but it's also true that at every reunion, I hear a few more stories from the women of our class about some of the indignities that they suffered with. And Doris's story was that she was in a class, and as I said before, they called us all by our last name. So they kept every time she would raise her hand, he would say, Mr. Dronsky. And at one point she said, would you mind? And she was very polite. She said, if you wouldn't mind, could you call me Ms. Dronsky or even Miss Dronsky? And the professor apparently said, I've been doing it this way for 30 years and I will continue to call you Mr. Dronsky. And this had been irking her for years. I didn't hear about it until maybe our 40th reunion.
Emma, for any of your viewers who are interested in the subject, a book by Ann Perkins called Yale Needs Women is an excellent history of those early years of coeducation.
Thank you. So next up on our questions from the audience is a bit of reflection on unity, both amongst individual Yale classes and across the generations. So what do you guys think are the activities or traditions that have bonded all Yaleys and make us all feel a sense of home at this institution? And Professor Gitlin and I think both other panelists mentioned football games as something that brought Yale students together. I think other than the Yale-Harvard game, I don't know a football game since I've been on campus that has had more than 10% of the student body attend. So how do you feel events like that benefited unity of the student body, and what do you think could be done either to revive them, or what do you think students are losing out now that our attentions have shifted to other activities?
I'll just say very quickly, I'm a huge believer in the power of music as a social force. And so I have been told by students many, many times, oh, why don't they teach us how to sing Bright College Years when we first come to Yale? So I think singing together is a great unifying force.
Emma, I do not think it is the role of either a university administration or the faculty to find ways to unify the students. That is the job of the students. They have to decide what it is that they want to be interested in or work on and become unified. I think the idea that a university would decide that everybody ought to, sing a song or play a football game is stupid. I think students have got to decide on what they want to be unified on.
Yeah, this is one of the overlooked aspects of the 1960s, but football was kind of a religion, particularly in the years, when Yale's football team was really good and had Brian Dowling and Calvin Hill, who went on to, great success in the National Football League. In my day, something that has disappeared was a lot of film societies.
Oh, yes.
Just about every college dining hall would put on a series of films, usually with some kind of theme. And, I found that pretty valuable. I don't think there's much besides football that actually connects the generations. I do miss the days when all of the college reunions were held the same weekend. But even then, I don't know that there was a lot of back and forth between the different tents, as entertaining as that might have been. I do think that Princeton does reunions better than Yale and encourages people to come, makes them cheap or even free in some cases. And there's a lot more mixing across the classes. Maybe that has some benefit. But, I just feel very glad that largely as a result of studying the university and getting to know people like Sam and Jay, I got to spend a lot of good times at other classes' reunions, which I really enjoyed. And I will always remember singing the lead on Daddy Was a Yale Man with the Yale class of 1948 Whiffenpoofs in Morris.
One of the activities that I think we've seen become very popular with a lot of Yale students, even amidst COVID, I think administrators have made exceptions for large gatherings, is protesting. I know there were a lot of events in the 1960s that led to widespread protesting, if not Yale protesting, and I would have appreciated an explanation of what you saw at Yale of those events. But what do you think is the role of the Woodward Report in Yale culture currently? How should it be possibly strengthened? And in general, what are your perceptions of Yale students' participation in these activities?
Well, the protests, that is either political in nature or issue in nature, really did occur beginning around 1963. Now, when I was in college, there were protests, but they were about silly things like which man was going to sell ice cream out in front of Commons. They had a terrible riot over that issue. But I think the most important thing to know about protests is that despite the fact that protests occur, the university is still chugging along. There are a lot of people who aren't part of the protests. People are going to classes. Things are continuing. So protests are something that a group of students feel passionate about and want the institution to either change a policy or make a new policy. But protests don't dominate 24 hours a day everybody's life.
Yeah, I will just add that even though I was at Yale, I would say the peak year for protests for my years as an undergraduate was my junior year. So that was 69-70, which ended with May Day and the Black Panther trials in New Haven. And that was also the first year of coeducation. So it was an amazing sea change. Generally speaking, there was sort of a student strike that was sort of a rather weak student strike, I would say. A lot of people came from outside of Yale. The administration, including Sam, was brilliant. They opened up the colleges rather than shut them down. And so there were lots of people from out of town coming by. And again, I offer this as a personal perspective. but just in case you think, so we were not very protest oriented. There were some people in our class who were. We certainly were not. We were, except for the May Day week, which was a lot of it coming from out of town. We were somewhat unaware of all that. But even at the height of all this, when people were coming in, it was May Day, there were tanks actually set up on the Grove Street Cemetery, and the militia had been called in just in case. So it was, stores were boarded up. In the middle of all this, I was walking down Elm Street, and I came across a guy I knew who was a jazz trumpet player who was from Indiana. I said, Mike, what are you doing here? And he was probably stoned, and he looked at me and he said, oh man, I thought it was a jazz festival.
The tradition of student protest goes a long way back. And in fact, Kingman Brewster, when he was an undergraduate, had been a national leader in the student movement that started the America First Committee, which was the leading force trying to keep the United States out of taking part in World War II. I am sure he subsequently came to believe that was the wrong thing to have done. But I think he also felt from this experience that students had something to say, and it was the job of faculty and administrators and the older generation more generally to listen to them and actually argue out these things with them. And he was always very happy that his best friend, McGeorge Bundy, had been later on the other side of that issue. And yet they still stayed perfectly good friends despite this intense political disagreement. And Kingman also liked the fact that at Yale in the 1960s, there were not only protests against the Vietnam War, there were also protests by conservatives in support of the Vietnam War. And in my time, there was the anti-apartheid movement, and that was fine. I think the important thing is not protest. Sometimes you can get really, horrific stories like what went on at Evergreen State, let's say. But the more insidious threat, perhaps, is just the feeling that you can't say things. And that you have to be worried about what you can say, because otherwise the reaction will be really bad. And I had a friend who graduated, just a few years ago, and he went to Russia on a Fulbright. And he said it was astounding because here I'm in Vladimir Putin's Russia, and I'm interviewing people, and they're telling me very openly these criticisms of Putin. And that was shocking to me because I'd just come from having spent 4 years in a place where people were afraid to say what they felt. So, I think this is something that we need to think about.
Let me just go back to the Woodward report. First of all, I think it should be the heart and soul of the institution. I don't happen to think it needs improvement. I happen to think the Chicago faculty statement is the best one of all of statements by various universities on free speech. But I think the Woodward report is a wonderful document and one that should bind everybody to the same standard.
That's great. Obviously, in the Buckley Program's mission is the focus on free speech and intellectual diversity. So we strongly advocate that Yale enforce the principles of the Woodward report. And I appreciate hearing from such devoted Yale administrators that there's such respect for the words in that report and what it means. I think for our next question, we have some questions in the Q&A box about academic rigor at Yale and the ideological makeup of discussion sections. So I'm curious, perhaps, especially following on Professor Gitlin, who has current students, what do you see as the benefits of a core sort of curriculum that was formerly a major feature of Yale, but has been dissolved in a lot of ways in both education and perhaps unity of the student experience at Yale? And what sort of broadness of ideas are Yale students now willing to put forth in the classroom and truly debate on a no holds barred, every idea gets intense scrutiny sort of playing field?
It's a little hard to answer a question like that. I certainly strive in my classes that no one should ever feel at all reticent about expressing themselves and disagreeing. I think we have real good, solid discussion in every class I run. I'm very proud of that. And I know I have people who are very liberal, very progressive, and I know I have a lot of conservative students in the class, and I think it is a classroom where they can all engage. That said, outside of the class, I have heard from some students who feel that they really can't express themselves, and that concerns me. I had one student who was actually from Venezuela who said, it's a good thing that I have a status like that because I can say what I want. So some students clearly feel like they can't, and I think that's problematic. I'm not really sure I'm answering the question. I'm not sure what the question's trying to get at, but at least in my classes, I'm doing what I can in my class to make it a good open forum. And I think it is. But sometimes people express themselves with a great deal of vehemence. So at one point in the Yale in America class, we ended up talking about what is the role of religion on campus today. And one student with a fair amount of vehemence said, well, thank God there's no role for religion on campus, because if there was, I'd leave. And she kind of closed off the conversation because she was rather vehement. And after class, one of the students, who was a first-gen student, he was Latinx, and he said to me, he said, God, I was really afraid to say anything. I go to St. Thomas More all the time, and it's a necessary support for me, and religion's very important to me. So I'm not sure, as Sam said earlier, a lot of this is for students to work out for themselves. You know, as hard as I try as a teacher, it's not always up to me to create the right atmosphere.
You know, Patel Chapel attendance used to be compulsory for Yale students up until the 1920s, when a student protest brought that practice to an end. And I think that's fine, you know. And actually, in the history of the faculty's evolution at Yale, a combined student-faculty rebellion against the freshman year program was actually fairly important in Yale's development, because, you know, that really was almost entirely a prescribed curriculum, and students were not free in freshman year to pursue their intellectual gleam. And, you know, again, part of the story of the 1960s is not just of the university moving left. I think the more important story is more opportunities for students to participate in small group discussions, the creation of the residential college seminars, and, you know, more subjects being brought in and studied at a serious level that had never been studied at Yale before, like film and writing. And these are all to the good, I think. You know, I gotta say that I think the most positive change at Yale since my undergraduate days is the creation of the Mellon Forum dinners, which are just wonderful for the students to get to hear about people undertaking a serious senior year intellectual endeavor. And that is also getting at the kind of creative experience that the original, I think, Dahl report, and actually, no, excuse me, I think it was Leonard Dub's report that was responding to the disappearance of the freshman year, wanted to have happen. And my only regret was that I was the only faculty member that ever took part in those Mellon Forum dinners. Never was another faculty member to be found. And if I could, you know, I don't know, mandate a change, but one would hope that faculty would take a greater interest in these kind of opportunities to talk to students in an informal setting like that.
Yeah, I'd like to just say about the residential colleges, two things. One is that I think students have a tendency to think that the sole purpose of the residential college is for them. Indeed, there are fellows of every college. There probably are so many that most students don't even know, maybe one or two. On the other side of the coin, there was a time when the faculty who were fellows took seriously their role in the residential college. And I think one of the great sadnesses is that we have these 14 beautiful facilities in which there is very little interaction between the fellows and the students. And it would be a wonderful thing if students and fellows could begin getting together and starting to change that.
The next question up comes from Dennis Tippo, and he's asking about the potential for conservative professors to be hired today and attain tenure, what do you find true and most descriptive about the ideological makeup of the faculty? I attended a talk by Robert George over the summer who said, while a few more conservative faculty have been willing to sort of uncloset themselves recently, there are a lot more conservative friendly faculty members willing to stand up for them. Do you see the same trend at Yale? And what do you think about how this affects the education of students?
Well, I'll jump in, and Jay and Jeff have both been faculty members. I was in the public health school, but let me just say that the way a faculty member is appointed is by the faculty of the department that he or she is going to be a member of. And whether or not there's a lot of conscious talk within appointments committees about a potential faculty member's personal political point of view, I've never been on a committee of that sort, but I doubt there is a lot of it. There is no question that universities, I think in general, seem to have more, just from anecdote, I don't know the statistics, but seem to have more liberals on the faculty than conservatives on the faculty. But I don't think that the faculty at Yale, in their committees, when they are deciding who they want to seek out as a new faculty member, spend an awful lot of time talking about the person's politics. I may be wrong. Jay, what do you think? And Jeff?
Yeah, I'll just weigh in very quickly. I don't think politics usually enters into the decision making, not in any kind of overt or explicit way. I think it has more to do with the scholarship. So there are certain types of inquiries that are favored by people who would be designated liberal progressives. So it's not that politics isn't a factor, because I think it, to be honest, I think it is, but it's more subtle than that. It really has to do with more the kinds of scholarship people produce. But I would still say, generally speaking, it's about whether somebody has written some fascinating books. Has they done something truly innovative? I think scholarship, in a somewhat objective way, still rules the roost, I would like to say. That said, politics is a factor that's very hard to tease out in this project, in this whole process. And I'll just say that the particular way that question, and I know Dennis, who asked the question, so hi, Dennis. The way the question was asked, it referred to Donald Kagan, if I may. And I just want to say about Donald Kagan that we played for both of his sons' weddings. And you've never seen more fun weddings in your life. This guy knew how to party. So I'll just leave it at that.
I mean, I'm going to disagree here. I don't think that academia is a hospitable environment for conservatives who want to join the faculty, not just at Yale, but really across the board. And I think it is related to what Jay's talking about. I don't think it's when an application crosses the table of the committee that's doing the hiring that they look for membership in Republican organizations. But I do think that they have persuaded themselves in many of these faculty conclaves that the kind of fields that Jay is talking about, which are of interest to conservatives, are almost by definition boring, irrelevant. Therefore, by definition, there can be no cutting edge, interesting, important scholarship coming from these fields. And that was why at different times in different departments, but you really saw an elimination of the kind of political history that was focused on Congress and the presidency. You really saw the disappearance of a lot of foreign policy history, obviously the disappearance of military history, to some extent of corporate history, business-related history, and intellectual history. I could really go down the list. And I think this is just groupthink, to be honest. I think people have persuaded themselves that they have the right answers, and they're not interested in intellectual diversity as such.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. Yep.
I think that's probably why.
What have you observed of the relationship between Yale College, the undergraduates, and the professional schools? And do you think it is strong enough or could be strengthened in ways that would benefit both groups of students?
I still have undergraduate advisees, and I would say, and I hope none of them are listening, that virtually none of them could even tell you what the graduate schools at Yale are, with the exception of maybe law and medicine. I think that in my view, Yale College has become too much, maybe it always was, has too much sure that the university is here for them. When half of the students and faculty are actually in another area. They're in the graduate and professional area. I think the good thing about the relationship is that students in both graduate schools and in the undergraduate school are allowed to take courses in cross courses without paying more money. In many universities, if you're an undergraduate and you want to take a course in the law school, you have to pay additional money. All you need here is the approval of the instructor. So I think intellectually there is some interaction between the two, but the fact that the undergraduates see the university as really existing for them is a very selfish view that I think they've got to learn to get away from.
You know, I was on both sides of that fence as an undergraduate and then as a grad student, so was Jay. You know, there's no doubt that grad school is the less important part of the university, but, you know, it's not unimportant. Whereas if you went back before the changes of the 1960s, it was almost an afterthought. You know, I would like to see more congress, I suppose, between the undergraduate world and the intellectual world of the university. And I think that's part of my wish, that undergraduate education be somewhat more intellectually focused than it is right now. And again, maybe the Mellon Forum or some other mechanisms might be the way to do that.
I feel fairly strongly about.
You might also remember that 50% of Yale's budget is in one graduate school.
Yeah, I just will speak very quickly. As Jeff said, so I graduated from Yale College. The next year I came back as a student in the School of Music. And I remember so distinctly still coming back, walking around campus and thinking, oh my God, what changed? Did I change? Did something? I just all of a sudden felt like I did not belong to this place in the same way. I felt like my status, I had become somewhat invisible. And so I thought that was very, very concerning. And I know my chief professor over the years, Howard Lamar, felt very strongly, and Howard, by the way, turns 97 next week. He felt very strongly that we should do more for the graduate students and the professional school students to bring them into the entire community. And I would like to suggest that, and something I've been working on over the years, was try to get more students from the professional schools and graduate students to be affiliates to the different residential colleges, which has made a big difference in their lives and how they look at Yale. Once they're part of the residential college life, they feel like, oh, this is Yale. This is where it is. So I would like to see more of that.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question before we have to log off here. But this has been an absolutely wonderful discussion. I think perhaps the best-selling book written about Yale or by a Yale alum is God and Man at Yale by none other than William F. Buckley Jr. So I'm curious if any of you have reflections on the book and perhaps criticisms or just thoughts on how well it represented your Yale experience.
Well, I mean, let me jump in on that subject because it came up in the questions. Buckley attended Yale at an odd time. He attended it when the university was attended by about twice as many undergraduates as it typically had because it offered a place to so many returning veterans from World War II. So overcrowding was a huge problem at that point, and that was the only episode really up until the 1970s that you found a lot of undergraduates living off campus, which does in its way detract from the unity of undergraduate life. You also had, at that point, a real shortage of faculty to teach all of these students. And so the departments drew on a lot of graduate students, since that was the subject of our previous discussion. And Bill Buckley found himself in sections taught by graduate students whose perspective was considerably to the left of the Yale faculty, let alone Bill Buckley. And he kind of wrote his book based on this experience that actually proved, not to be true in the rest of the decade, because once the military veterans had passed through the system, Yale in the 1950s, Sam can attest, went back to trying to create the 1920s. And yet, the veterans, that moment was very interesting. All of the faculty whom I interviewed back in the 90s said those were the best bunch of students we ever had. Because, these were the students who for the first time understood Shakespeare. Many of them were married, they'd suffered loss, they'd seen battle, they knew things that most undergraduates simply never do because you're talking about 18-year-olds. So, in terms of the diversity of Yale, one angle that doesn't get talked about too much is maybe there's room for diversity of age. Maybe, the problem with our meritocracy in that it kind of chooses winners at such an early age could be mitigated by getting older students in there who've seen some experiences, who can push back against the limited undergraduate perspective. I think something like that might have some good effect.
Maybe nobody should be allowed to come to Yale until they've done something else for 5 years.
Not a bad idea.
I'd like to just say a word. I'm not sure Bill's book was as influential really as Bill was. Bill was an extraordinary man on this campus, even though he didn't work here or so on. He was the debate between Bill Buckley and Brent Bozell and Vern Countryman and Tommy, whatever Harper's name was, about McCarthy was one of the greatest events I've ever been to. Woolsey Hall was packed to the rafters, and the subject was Senator Joseph McCarthy is good for America. And this was a magnificent debate, and the two young men destroyed the two law professors. I mean, it was just a great evening. Bill came to every reunion. One of the greatest things about his, I think he was 50, I'm not sure 50 or 51. 50. When he came to his reunion, Bill Coffin was in the same class. And
Coffin was in 40.
Well, when you went to that tent, Bill Coffin and Bill Buckley would be going at it. And everybody was crowded around, and they just were listening to these two brilliant men go at each other. So Buckley's influence in Yale was enormous. I'm not sure the book itself on the subject of religion and so on was where he made his greatest impact.
Emma, I'll just say that I actually assigned God and Man at Yale in my Yale American class. That said, we take a very critical look at the book, which I'm not a big fan of. I think there are a lot of problems with the book, but I will recommend this book, which I just purchased about a week ago, The Unmaking of a Mayor, the Vindication Edition, because Bill Buckley ran against John Lindsay, of course, two Yaleys, and there's some really funny stuff in this book. So I'll just read you a short passage. He's talking about John Lindsay, talking about the Democratic candidate that he's running against, Abe Beam. And Lindsay says, quote, that Beam promises not progress, but procrastination, not ideas, but indifference, not energy, but evasiveness, not advancement, but apathy. And then Buckley says, what is wrong with that sentence other than its suicidal search for alliteration?
I can't help but to mention here that when Buckley was asked at his first press conference when he announced his campaign for mayor, he was asked what he would do if he actually won, to which he replied, demand a recount.
Those are the days.
Well, I think sadly that brings us to the close of this wonderful discussion. I would like to thank our three panelists for taking the time out of their lives to join the Buckley Conference and give such wonderful insights on their experiences at Yale. And I would also like to recognize the many Yale alumni who have logged on and watched this. It's exciting to hear questions from people who are also at Yale further back than my current experience as a student. And the Buckley program is extremely happy that you choose to engage with us and attend our talks. And so with that, thank you so much. And I wish everybody here the best.
Thank you, Emma. And
Thank
great
you,
stuff, Sam.